Hello, I'm Lily, and my extension project is on the biological factors of schizophrenia. To start off, we need to know what schizophrenia is. In the DSM, it's known as this schizophrenia spectrum disorder. Um, it's a spectrum dissociative disorder characterized by difficulty with reality, hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia. This is how our textbook actually describes it, and it's referred to now as a spectrum disorder because of the spectrum of symptoms and severity of symptoms that people who suffer this disorder face. So, usually for schizophrenia, symptoms are split into two categories: positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms are things that are added on to your usual behavior, such as the hallucinations and delusions that are very characteristic of schizophrenia. And secondly is negative symptoms, so things that will be considered normal behavior that are not present in a person with schizophrenia. So these would be things like decreased emotions and asociality, so withdrawing from society more than you would be expected to. And for this class, we'll be looking at three biological factors of schizophrenia, asking three questions about them. I don't say causes of schizophrenia because there's not any specific one easy cause of schizophrenia. There are instead various factors that researchers believe to influence the development of this disorder. And we'll be looking at what brain structure and brain functions are characteristic of schizophrenia, what are the genetic factors of schizophrenia, and lastly, what neurotransmitters are involved in schizophrenia. Firstly, we will look at brain structure. So, something that is found in people with schizophrenia is that the ventricles in their brain are enlarged compared to those unaffected with the disorder. And they've also found that there's decreased gray matter in the frontal and temporal lobes. This has been revealed through CT research. So, like, we've learned about all these kinds of different research methods. The CT is one of them that they've used to just look at the structure of the brain in people with schizophrenia. And so this specifically implies a loss in neurological tissue because ventricles themselves, remember, produce that like spinal fluid that we've learned about when we learned about the brain, and gray matter itself is myelinated axons. So this implies that there's this loss in neurological tissue, the brain's not as protected, and there's probably less neurons and neurological activity going on in someone with schizophrenia if these places are smaller or bigger. And as for brain function, researchers have used PET scans, so positron emission tomography, where they put in that glucose tracker that then looks at like where places are more active or not in the brain, because to expel energy you need glucose in that process. So they've found that there's lower glucose metabolism in frontal regions of the brain when people are in states of rest or not, compared to non schizophrenic people. So, this indicates a lower neuronal activity because the glucose isn't being used which then implies that neurons aren't being fired, which is something that uses energy. And you can see in this picture, the the red indicates like a higher activity, and you see more of that in the front of the control brain compared to the schizophrenic brain. And on to our next topic is what are the genetic factors of schizophrenia. There are quite a bit actually. There's no specific schizophrenia gene that can be expressed and then like explain the presence of this disorder, but there are various factors that we've learned about actually that help help us understand why this disorder happens. So firstly is heritability, which is um how like the way that heritability and genetics can explain why we have a disorder, and that is 80%. So genetics explain 80% in the variation of the expression of this disorder. And for concordance rates, in identical twins, if one identical twin has schizophrenia, there's a 48% chance that the other twin would also have schizophrenia, which only explains about half of that. So, another thing that researchers think is important, an important genetic factor of schizophrenia, is the diathesis stress model, something we also learned about, which they think influences the manifestation of the disorder because there are these genetic like genes and stuff that are affecting this, but there's also like a lot of other disorders like anxiety or depression. There's your environment around you that works in tandem with your susceptibility, genetic susceptibility to a disorder. Like they work together to influence the manifestation. So if you're things like drug use or trauma, stress, that kind of thing can work in tandem with your genes to manifest schizophrenia. And another factor is known as genome-wide association studies. This isn't covered in the textbook, but they basically look at gene variations at the same time in people with a certain trait to try and determine the roles of those genes in the expression of that trait. So, as for schizophrenia, over 300 of these variants have been linked with schizophrenia, but that only explains about 22.5% of the variants in the heritability. So it doesn't explain that much, but it's a good starting point. And this picture, it helps visualize it a little easier. It shows you're looking at patients with whatever disorder, schizophrenia in our case, and non patients, you're looking at their DNA and you compare their DNA to discover these single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are basically those variants that I mentioned. Um, and that helps you discover which ones are disease or disorder specific compared to non disorder specific. And lastly, we'll be looking at the neurotransmitters involved in schizophrenia. Firstly, the dopamine hypothesis is one of the big hypotheses in schizophrenia. So they think that the overaction of dopamine receptors, specifically the D2 dopamine receptor, um, leads to an expression of symptoms of schizophrenia. They found that blocking the receptors reduces symptoms with dopamine antagonists. So that means that dopamine agonists, like certain drugs, produce symptoms of schizophrenia. We've also found that schizophrenia patients have overactive dopamine systems in their hippocampus, as well as dysregulation in other areas in their brain compared to those without it. And lastly, there's the glutamate hypothesis, which is kind of like the opposite of the dopamine hypothesis. It looks at an underactivation of glutamate being involved with the manifestation of schizophrenic symptoms. And they found that drugs that are antagonistic or prevent the expression of glutamate have led to schizophrenic symptoms, which are the drugs they've looked at are ketamine and PCP. And this picture on the right here shows us PCP preventing this neuron from firing, um, as it's an antagonist to glutamate. We can see like how we learned about how the neuron fires and its membrane. The PCP is blocking anything from happening with glutamate. And so that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. And at the end here are the sources. And thank you.